Well, good morning, friends. How we doing? We enjoying the show? We having fun? Fantastic. For those of you that haven't met me yet this week, my name is Nate Schutta. I work for VMware. Best way to describe me is architect as a service. I go places, I talk to people, I point at shiny things, ask impertinent questions, and then get on an airplane before anybody can, get mad at me for saying something I'm not supposed to. When someone first called me architect as a service, I thought, hey, that's kind of cool because everything's as a service today. And one of the things that I've longed for at almost every conference venue I've ever been at is bathrooms as a service. You get to the restroom and it's like, come on, what's going on? It's like a concert in here. Who could have predicted that? Although I will admit, I did sound the acronym for architect as a service out in my head and realized that it may not have been intended as the compliment that I was taking it at, but I'm trying to take it in a positive spin. So I do a lot of thinking and talking about architecture. That's kind of my space. I wrote this little ebook last year on thinking architecturally. My wife jokingly called it a pamphlet when she saw it in paper format because it's one of these little report-like things, which frankly I think is more practical and useful because I don't know about you, but I've got an awful lot of technical books on my shelf that are like 1/3 read. And so I think it's probably in our best interest to try to just digest that down to the 1/3 that's actually useful and interesting to you as opposed to trying to get to a certain page count. There actually was a time in technical publishing where some publishers, not all, some publishers would send out a contract and it was by page count. It's like you had to have a certain page count or they were very upset with you. There was this for this brief period of time, technical publishers thought we all bought books based on how big they were. It's like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking for in a book. I've lived in this cloud space now for probably 4 or 5 years, and it's been a fascinating sort of intersection of new technology and FUD and everything in between. And you realize pretty quickly there's a lot of options, there's a lot of things that crop up. I know a lot of people, they think cloud, they immediately think microservices, they think modular monoliths, maybe you're gonna put a whole bunch of stuff in containers. Maybe you're like, no, I just want everything to live in this serverless world. Functions as a service sounds like the way to go. And you're probably figuring out what polycloud or hybrid cloud means to you. And we kind of sit here and go, man, there's a lot of different stuff I got to get my head wrapped around. And to be clear, there are serious engineering issues that we have to overcome in these environments. There's an awful lot of automation that has to happen. There's a lot of change that's going on here. And admittedly, some people think magic sparkle ponies actually exist, and if we just buy the right magic sparkle pony, all of our problems go away. But we have to realize that the technology isn't the only thing we're changing. When I first got into software, I thought if a project failed, it's because we made a bad technical choice. We chose the wrong language, we chose the wrong framework, we chose the wrong app server. And the older I've gotten, the more experience I've gotten, the more I realize that we have to understand the cultural shift that comes along with any kind of technology change. And I never had a class in my computer science background on culture, how to deal with it. And I know for a lot of us, we get into this industry because I just don't want to deal with messy people and, they're so vague and I just want things that make sense and I understand the grammar and all that. But you know what? That's not how it works in the real world. We have to interact with people. And I have seen situations where you bring in a good technology, but you forget about the cultural shift and that technology plummets, not because it was a bad technology choice, but because we didn't address the cultural change. Now, every one of your organizations has a culture. Yours is unique and interesting. And I remember at one point I was having this conversation with my manager. I was complaining about something like, hey, how come we can't move faster? I worked at a big financial services company for a bunch of years. And he sort of looked at me and said, hey, Nate, what do you think the paint was like? What color were the walls when I interviewed here 5 years ago? I said, I have no idea, Jeff. He said, Nate, it's the same color they are today. I'm like, I have no idea what you're trying to tell me, Jeff. He said, Nate, if they don't change the paint on the walls every so often just to change the paint in the walls, you're living in a place that doesn't like change. He says, we will get to the right answer. We just might not get there as fast as you'd like us to. You have to understand that this culture is conservative and moves slowly. The fascinating thing to me about culture is it gets set very, very early on in the existence of a company. You hire, you attract, you retain based on your corporate culture. I mean, how many times have you been sitting around talking about a candidate and you talk about culture fit? Are you a good culture fit? Are we a good culture fit for you? Because it fundamentally informs almost everything we do in our corporate lives in both small and large ways. This financial services company I worked at for years, you would not believe the battles we had over wearing jeans. We had the head of HR was on record as saying, I hate jeans. I went to college and got a master's degree so I'd never have to wear jeans again in my entire life. And so there were like 4 times a year you could wear jeans, and that was it. The funny thing to me, I left that company and a friend of mine retired, and so I went to his retirement party and I walked in and I saw a whole bunch of people wearing jeans and I'm like, hey, what's going on? Is it like a jeans day in May? How'd this happen? He said, oh no, as soon as so-and-so retired, like literally the next day, the CEO said, hey, you know what? Dress for your day. So if you want to wear jeans, great. And I thought, wow, that was literally that one individual who was standing in between my ability to wear comfortable pants. I am very much of the opinion that culture is where good ideas go to die. I have seen this time and time again, and you have to fundamentally understand that changing your culture is hard and it takes a long time. It does not happen overnight. It takes years. Keep in mind, the people who have risen to a place of power in your organization have generally figured out how to game that culture. And as soon as you come along and say, I want to change it, they're like, whoa, wait, I don't want the rules to change. I know how to win this game. A good friend of mine was doing a bunch of work at a large big box electronic retailer that you've all heard of. And he's doing a lot of really cool stuff. And what was fascinating is this was being directed from above, like the CIO, CTO, everybody was on board with this. There's grassroots support. Everyone's like, yes, this is exciting, this is awesome, this is what we should be doing. And yet a whole bunch of these initiatives died because they hit what he referred to as the middle management mafia. Because they didn't want anything to change. They didn't want anything to disrupt their fiefdoms. And one of the things that's become very clear to me as I work with different companies is the most dangerous phrase you can ever hear in an organization is, that's how we've always done it. And I hear this all the time. I was at one customer a couple years ago, and they're having a performance issue, and so I was trying to help them figure that out, and they were walking me through their architecture, and essentially they overnight would process groups of widgets. You know, process widget 1, go process widget 2, process widget 3, go on to the next group, rinse, repeat. And the problem was they'd been really successful, and so they kept getting more widgets and bigger boxes of widgets, and they had more to process, and they wasn't finishing overnight. And so I asked what I thought was a fairly obvious question. I said, does the results of processing widget 1 have any impact on the processing widget 2? And they said, nope, not at all. I said, could you do them in parallel? And it's just sort of like light bulb moment. Now, I'm not infinitely smarter than anyone else that was in that room. I just didn't have their baggage. I didn't have their, well, we've always done it that way. How else could we possibly do it? Now, the other thing we have to keep in mind is this famous quote, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. We see this a lot when we try to do technology change. I'll throw one other quote at you here. This is Machiavelli. You've all heard of him. The innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, all the people who have risen to a place of power. They don't want that to change. You have lukewarm defenders and all those who are sitting on the sidelines just waiting to see how things come out. I'm not going to place a bet until I have a pretty good idea of how this is going to change. This is summed up as the curse of culture. This is something Ben Thompson has talked about, and it's a fascinating read talking about how companies have a really hard time adapting. It's no different than The Innovator's Dilemma, if you remember that book. And really what it boils down to is this phrase, culture is one of a company's most powerful assets right up until it isn't. And we don't always realize when that change is happening. So you have to be aware of your culture, and you have to understand that changing your culture is hard and it takes time. What's fascinating is it's very similar to me to that Ernest Hemingway quote, how did you go bankrupt? 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly. Now, I assure you it can be done, but you have to be patient. So the organization I worked at for a pretty good chunk of my career went from doing very traditional waterfall to, unsurprisingly, doing more agile development. And yes, we can have all sorts of debates about where are they on that agile journey. Actually, a friend of mine just emailed me this week, and I asked him how things are going. He says, well, we're still on the agile journey. I'm like, big shock there. So when we first started down this path, one of the things that we needed were project rooms. And so we go to our facility people and we say, we need some project rooms. And so what do? They're like, we don't know what that is. And we explained it to them, and they said, no, you don't understand. We arrange little felt boxes and rectangles, and that's what we do. We don't know what these project rooms are. So we just kept poking and prodding, and we booked out a conference room for a year. That kind of got their attention. And then eventually they're like, okay, fine. You can have this dank, dark interior conference room that nobody ever books out anyway because it has no light, it has no cell coverage. It's really, the only nice thing I could say about that room, and I lived in that room for a while, if a tornado had hit the building, we would not have noticed. But your cell phone was useless in there. You literally had to leave the project room, go out in the hallway if you needed to make a phone call. But you know what? It was a place to start. And we were able to show success, build some credibility, show why this was important, and it served as a model. And so eventually we said, all right, this is what we're looking for. We want more of these. And what was really fascinating was to see when that sort of bit started to flip and the facilities people started getting excited and they're like, hey, do you want us to take these 2 rooms and knock the wall out? And we could put glass walls and you could draw on the walls and we could they just started exploding with ideas once they realized they could be free from their constraints too. And it just grew from there. Now, before I left that organization, they renovated the IT floors, and it's all project rooms now. Big ones, small ones, medium-sized ones, everything in between. There were no questions here. But this is a multi-year journey. Now, admittedly, this is a lot easier if you are the person in charge. Several years ago, this piece came out called the Bezos Mandate. It was something that Steve Yegge had written. He intended it to be internal to Google employees, and he set the bits wrong, and it went public, and so everybody got to read it. It was about his time at Amazon as well as his time at Google, and it was essentially saying, hey, here's what Amazon does better than Google, here's what Google does better than Amazon. And so he talked about the Bezos Mandate. So at some point along the lines, Jeff Bezos went to his technical people and said, all right, here's how this is going to roll. All data is going to be exposed through a public service interface. That's going to be the communication channel. No other forms of communication are allowed. No direct reads, no links, nothing like that, no backdoors. By the way, every single one of your services needs to be designed to be public. Doesn't necessarily mean it will be, but if we decide this is useful to make it a public API, we're going to do that. There are no exceptions to these rules. If you do not agree with these rules, great, you're fired. As you can probably guess, developers reacted to this new incentive, and they started to change. Now, as much as many of us may wish we had that kind of clout in our organization, we probably don't. We have to be more subtle about this. We have to think outside the box a bit. There's this fascinating sort of argument about why does that company have better developers than we do? And Cockcroft's got a great way of talking about this. He says, we don't have, someone's sort of challenged him, so we don't have your superstar engineers. And he said, we hired them from you and we got out of their way. And he went on to say, you don't add innovation to a culture, you get out of its way. Now that's hard because, again, a lot of people in a leadership position, they want control. They want to be able to tell people what to do. And it's very difficult to say, I'm going to step back from this and I'm going to see what emerges. Now there's an interesting piece that just came out of ThoughtWorks recently talking about how they're trying to do culture change through design. So there's all sorts of ways we can start to shift culture. We just have to understand that it does not happen overnight. It's going to be a long process. I have seen instances where the easiest thing to do is just start a whole new culture. So you spin up a lab, or you have a special floor, or you have a wholly owned subsidiary. I've seen that a few times. They're like, okay, you all now work for this company, and you guys are off-site potentially. You do your own thing. My previous organization, they did a couple different things like this. There was one individual who spun up, I guess you would call it kind of a special floor. There was a certain part of the building that you had to have the right badge access, and they all wore t-shirts and jeans, and they're like, haha, you can't touch us because we're on the magic floor. And they had fridges full of food and beer and everything and ping pong tables. But it was a very condensed kind of thing, and it was free of all the typical constraints that the rest of the company had. Now, what you hope to do with that is essentially evolve that out, and sort of you send those little particles out into the universe to kind of take that culture with it and grow it in other places. But in a lot of cases, that is the simplest thing to do. Let's just start fresh with people that are all on board with this particular approach. Now, having been doing this for a while, changing a technology is comparatively easy. I don't want to say it's trivial, because it's not. Any of you who have been through any of these understand that bringing in a new technology has plenty of challenges in it. But we ignore culture at our own peril. And if we think that the technology is somehow going to paper over those cultural shifts, we're in for some pain. Now, what's fascinating to me is in a lot of cases, it's our org chart that's hurting us as we try to make these shifts. At some point, you've heard of the Conway Law, right? This whole notion that your systems ultimately end up reflecting the org chart. So whatever systems, whatever structures you've got in these systems ultimately are a copy of the communication structure of your organization. And so for many of us now, we're trying to build these more distributed architectures, and we can argue around the edges of what that means. But how do I create small, isolated services if my organization isn't, in fact, a series of small, isolated teams? And that's where some companies sort of practice this inverse Conway maneuver, where they say, you know what, let's do this. Let's evolve our org structure towards the kinds of systems we want, and then see what kind of systems come out of that, as opposed to trying to go the other direction. You do get some very interesting outcomes from that. Although one of the things that a lot of people don't remember is as soon as I break everything apart, I have to somehow recreate some of those communication channels, because those individual isolated services have to work together to solve business problems. So now I have to think about, how do I get these teams to work together? Because we are inevitably going to run into that, hey, my incentives don't align with yours. I've thought about this a lot with these microservice architectures. Traditionally, if I own a service, I'm responsible for its infrastructure cost. But what do I do when you're calling my service, and you're calling my service, and you're calling my service, and you're calling my service? Do I charge you back for that? In some companies, I guess you would. Now we got to get into a whole thing about rate limiting and how do I even know who's calling me. What do I do if you're like 90% of my traffic and I had to increase my infrastructure spend to support your needs? Do I charge you back for that? Do I eat that? That's a cultural thing. That's an accounting thing, even though it's a very real technology problem that we have to solve. What do I do when you want to change that's incompatible with what he wants? What do I do if you're 90% of my traffic and your change is incompatible with him? He's only 4% of my traffic. Do I say, haha, sorry, sucks to be you? Do I make a new service for you? And these are real issues that we have to overcome. We get so caught up in the latest version of a language, or I want to use this new framework, or I want to use this database. We forget about some of these more arcane kind of, I guess you'd almost call them banal kind of problems that we have to deal with. We got to think about what it means to build out infrastructure and operations team to support that. How do you staff all that up? There are some companies who have a huge operations staff. That's generally not the way your customers want to spend their IT resource budget, by the way. I've seen some fascinating things where you've got like an ops organization that's like 500 people deep supporting an application area of like 2,000 people, and you're like, this doesn't seem like a good sort of allocation of resources. Now, interestingly enough, if you go in and say, we're going to slash the IT operations budget, you know who's going to come out against that? The VP of IT operations. So you have to understand that there's going to be some headcount battles, there's going to be some turf wars that inevitably come up in these situations. That's why you see a lot of these organizations trying to evolve to, hey, you build it, you own it. Which of course means you have to ask yourself, are my team members ready for pager duty? How do people feel about being on call? How do people feel about knowing that their weekend might get ruined because there was a problem in production? Because I can't just say that's an operations problem now. Now, the other big thing that we have to remember here is this is an evolutionary thing. We all have what many of us would refer to as legacy systems. And legacy typically has a very negative connotation to it, doesn't it? I prefer heritage, actually. I think that's a little more positive. Actually, I think it was Phil Webb just tweeted out, I prefer profitable. And he's absolutely right. And I admit, when I was a younger developer, mostly because I was forced to try to maintain these monstrosities, I didn't have a very positive connotation to me of legacy. I now realize if you've got a system that's been running in production for 10 or 15 or 20 years, has been providing value to your business for 10 or 15 or 20 years, you should pat yourself on the back. Congratulations, that's awesome. That is not something to be ashamed of. Now, of course, cloud gives us all these interesting capabilities. We can scale up, we can scale down, we get limitless compute with a giant asterisk at the end of it, which is additional fees may apply. People kind of forget about that. A friend of mine was telling me someone in her company spun up a function in a dev environment just to play with it, and they forgot to turn it off. A month later, they got a $100,000 charge for that one function. And I'm sure that was a very uncomfortable conversation. Now, another friend of mine was telling me that some of the data scientists at one of their clients got very excited about, oh, I can spin all this stuff up and look at all this cool stuff we can do. And they ran something that ended up creating like 69,000 VMs. And the next day, their cloud provider called them and said, are you planning on doing that again? Because if you are, we got to go buy some more compute. And then the bill showed up. And then the CFO said, you're not planning on doing that ever again, are you? Now, these fees can be kind of opaque. This is one of my all-time favorite tweets. After several attempts to stop paying AWS 80 cents every month, I spent an hour digging around trying to figure out what I forgot to turn off, and now I get a recurring bill for 23 cents. Think about how much an hour of her time had to cost. You know, and this is what happens. A friend of mine, his job is forensic accountant. He basically comes in and looks at your AWS bill and figures out how to make it smaller. So this isn't just a pattern, it's this interesting combination of techniques, technology, agile development, continuous delivery, lots of automation. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. Containers, microservices, functions. Again, this changes our culture. We can't do right-click deploy anymore. We can't do it works on my desktop. We can't have a manual process here. There's going to have to be more automation. There's going to have to be people that are responsible for that. Infrastructure has changed radically in my career. There's been this massive, massive shift from homegrown, bespoke, artisanal servers. Many of you remember the time where we literally took the pieces and plugged them into the motherboard and slid it into the rack. We spent days handcrafting these things. We treated them like pets. We gave them pithy names. I worked at one company where all our servers were named after Simpsons characters. Here's the thing about pets. We care about our pets. These are my pets. This is Han and Chewie. We name our animals after movies. Our two older cats that passed away several years ago now were Benny and June, for those of you that are old enough to remember that movie. Now, Han and Chewie are, for all practical accounts, members of the family. There's just no getting around it. They run the house. I've actually thought that they have a pretty darn good life. If I was ever to be reincarnated, house cat is very high on my list. Were Han or Chewie to develop so much as a sniffle, I know that my family would compel me to spend borderline limitless amounts of money trying to make them happy and healthy again. And that's how we used to feel about our named servers. And of course, these were this heavily constrained resource. They were very expensive, so we had to get our money's worth out of it, and that's where app servers came from. And it was in our best interest to put as many apps as possible on those servers to maximize ROI. And of course, that particular non-technical decision had some unintended technical side effects, because now we have shared resources. My bug takes your app down, I'm sorry. I came into work on a random Monday morning and one of my applications was down, and I started digging into it and discovered that, over the weekend, someone had made a MIME type change on that server, 10 applications on that box, 9 went down. The only one that stayed up was the one that wanted the MIME type change. I do not, for the life of me, know why we didn't catch that in a lower region. I don't know why that caused a problem, but it did. Coordinating changes in this environment was a hoot. I remember putting together one architecture, and I had the expectation that our new strategic single sign-on solution would be available as my application was getting ready to go to production. And so I lined up all my ducks in a row to be on the right, the new images of the servers, and I worked with security guys. And so I'm like, okay, cool, when can I have the new single sign-on solution? And I was told, well, you have to wait until we update all of the servers in the company before we make any changes to any of the existing images. And I said, oh, that's great, when's that gonna be? Oh, it'll be next May. And so this tactical security infrastructure that we were relying on wasn't going to be there for a couple months as I had intended. This application was going to have to live on that for almost a year and a half, because you can't have nice things because the Wombat app is moving very, very slowly. Every one of you has been in a situation where I really want to go to the next version of Java, and you're told, I'm sorry, you can't, because we have one app that's not ready to move off of 1.2 or 1.4 or some incredibly old thing. I've been through currency projects, too many of them, frankly. They're no fun for anybody. And this is why a lot of organizations said, you know what, we're not even going to mess around with currency. That's somebody else's problem. We're going to kick the can down the street. If you're the VP, your hope is that you can outlast it. I can move on in a year and it'll be somebody else's problem after I leave. And there was a lot of fear associated with this. And so that makes me think of that wonderful Yoda quote, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. I had no idea that we had been practicing Yoda ops, but we did. And of course, in this environment, what we were doing, we were moving code from one server to another. We were overlaying code on top of old code, and if it didn't work, there was really no way to revert. So fingers crossed, hope it all works. And so inevitably, you had that experience where it worked in one region but not another, and you start beating your head against the table, and you're like, why? What life choices led me to this place? Because the environments are supposed to be identical. I remember one particularly painful instance. We spent like 2 weeks tracking down what was different between these regions. And it turns out the patches were applied in a different order. And this is where you start to really question, why are you in software? Like, is there a better way to make a living? Now, obviously, things have changed. Servers are commodities today. Linux and Intel have replaced these sort of custom OS, these specialized bits of hardware. And that leads to this wonderful tweet. Hey, what are clouds made of? Linux servers mostly. That's what I tell my kid if he ever asks me. And what have we seen? Prices have come down. Servers are no longer the constraining factor. Turns out we are. We're the expensive bits. So things like Heroku and AWS and App Engine and Cloud Foundry and Azure and all these things start popping up. And we realize, hey, you know what? Shared servers are actually a liability. We shouldn't treat them like pets. We should treat them like cattle. When a cow gets sick on a large cattle operation, we don't spend a lot of time trying to fix that cow. In fact, we don't even give that cow a name. We give that poor cow a number. If poor number 15 gets sick, we get a new instance of number 15. Sorry, 15. And that has led us to a whole bunch of new abstractions. With containers and platforms, we now just say, hey, let's put everything together. And that's the thing we're going to move. In fact, in many cases, we're not even moving it at all. We're just changing a routing table. A whole class of problems just disappears. Did it work in this region? Cool, of course it's going to work in the next region because it's the same thing. That's a win for us. None of us has ever said, can you add more variables to the equation because I feel like a challenge today? So, does your app need a new version? Great, knock yourself out. It doesn't affect anybody else. You are isolated. That fundamentally moves the value line for us. It gets us out of doing this undifferentiated heavy lifting. This is one of my favorite images. This is my old boss, Andrew Clay Schaefer. Good job configuring servers this year, said no CEO ever. None of your customers has ever come to you and said, hey, what version of Linux are we running on? Can we get on the latest patch version of Linux, please? They don't care about that. They want features, they want functionality. Everything else is just dial tone. This fundamentally changes development for us. We can finally embrace that always be changing mindset. We can run A/B tests. We can experiment. We can be much more responsive to our business partners. We can start turning things around in days, not months. When I first started writing software, I think the most common estimate was like 18 months. Everything was 18 months. Didn't even matter what they asked for. It's like, hey, when can we get new paper in the printer? 18 months. It just was the default answer. It's like 42. And that was fine 20 years ago. It doesn't work today because our competitors are able to turn things around much more quickly than that. So at Spring One a few years ago, a gentleman from Scotiabank was talking about their journey from the traditional, I'm going to do 4 releases a year, to 3,000 releases a month. Now that didn't happen overnight. That took many years. A lot of engineering discipline, a lot of culture change made that happen. The reality, whether it's convenient or not, is speed matters today. Disruption is impacting every one of your businesses. There is no industry today that's immune. So a whole bunch of grocery store chains thought, oh yeah, we don't have to worry about Amazon. And then they woke up to the news that Amazon bought Whole Foods and went, oh, I guess Amazon's a competitor now. I've seen some insurance companies say we think Google is one of our biggest competitors. The moral of the story is we are all technology companies today. Now, in order for this all to work, in order for us to be able to be more responsive, to be able to move fast safely, there has to be automation in place. We can't do this by hand anymore. I've been a part of far too many of these situations where it's like, okay, well, I do a right click, and then I do this, and then I copy this over to here, and there's a whole lot of manual stuff. Bespoke doesn't work here. I love bespoke artisanal coffee, a bespoke artisanal sandwich. I don't like bespoke artisanal applications. Because here's the reality. Human beings are incapable of doing the same thing twice. If you doubt me on this, take up golf as a hobby and get back to me. Now, while I enjoy golf quite a bit, and it doesn't really, well, it bothers me because it's really frustrating when you hit a perfect shot and then literally the next swing you like hit it off in the woods and you're like, I'm the same person. It was 45 seconds. What could possibly have changed in 45 seconds? Apparently a lot. We need consistency in our world. We need CI and CD pipelines. Now, this does not imply that a developer does a commit and 30 seconds later that's running in production. You certainly can do things like that, but quite frankly, no one starts there. Many of us are familiar with CI. This has been around quite a while now. So you merge your code on a regular basis so that we don't have merge hell. We don't have tons and tons of conflicts. Merge hell is not fun for any of us. Anytime there's a commit, that triggers this set of automated things that happen, tests, code, quality scans, etc. We want to make sure that any new code doesn't break existing stuff. The next step in that whole process is continuous delivery. That takes the build up a notch, and that really answers that question, how do we release changes into an environment? We want this to be automated. The moral of the story is you get to decide when you release. Now, it isn't just you personally, it's your team, it's your customers, it's your business partners, all these kind of things. What we're striving for, though, is I want to be in a releasable state basically all the time. So that if a customer says, yes, I want that business value right now, you go, okay, no problem, there you go, enjoy. Now, it's always amazed me that we used to think that quarterly releases were somehow less risky than making more frequent changes. I mean, just ponder this for a second. It sure makes a lot of sense to me to work in small batches because that makes it a much smaller surface area for us to have mistakes. If I put one change into production and there's a problem, it's fairly easy for me to backtrack to what caused the problem. A quarterly release cycle has hundreds, if not thousands, of mutations in it, which seemingly always lead to a build break, and almost always mean we are locked in a windowless conference room at 3 in the morning, once again questioning our life choices. When you've got 1,500, 3,000, 9,000 changes in a release, which one caused the break? I have no idea. I push 1 or 2 or 3 changes, hey, that's a lot easier for me to reverse engineer. Now, the other side effect of this is if you want to get better at something, you need to have reps. My favorite example of this is tying shoes. Is there anyone in this room who does not know how to tie shoes? We all learn this when we're, like 2, 3, I don't know. I still remember the feeling I had when I finally got it to work. I'm like, oh my God, it worked. Now, if I were to ask you, and I'm sure almost every one of you tied your shoes this very morning, explain to me how to tie shoes, you'd be like, this. You just do some kind of hand motion because you don't even know how to verbalize it. How did you get so good, so fast, so efficient at tying shoes? You only do it like once a year? Of course not. You do it hundreds of times a year. So if you do something infrequently, you are not going to get better at it. If you do something often, you will improve. That's part of the mantra here. Deploy early, deploy often, because that's what will incent you to buff off those rough edges. You will get better. Now, the other side effect here is you must have trust in that process. You need robust pipelines. There's a ton of great tools in this space. If you aren't sure what is a good tool to use, guess what? The Spring folks are kind of opinionated. They've got ideas. I want to emphasize the goal here is not to own your build. It is a build, test, stage, prod, flow. It is a starting point. Modify from here. Automation is table stakes today. You cannot be competitive without it. This is part of the reason why we're seeing this shift towards SRE. For those of you that are unfamiliar, go look up this book. It's online. It's free. You can read it. The beauty of this book, as far as I'm concerned, bless you, is you do not need to read it cover to cover. It's a bunch of essays kind of loosely grouped together over themes. You read one, put the thing down, come back a week later, a month later, read another one. Doesn't matter what order you read it in. It's very, very useful. And so that leads me to the next step, which is this sort of DevOps SRE concept. Now, when we first started doing DevOps in my career, it was, DevOps engineers are going to fill out the tickets so the developers don't have to fill out the tickets. Now, as a developer, I was kind of happy about this because I hated filling out tickets. Tickets in an enterprise are a game you cannot win. The only time I ever succeeded at getting a ticketing system right is if I knew someone who had managed to somehow fill out the form correctly, and I'd say, can I borrow that? And I would copy it, and I would make the changes I needed, and then hopefully it would work. And of course, if enough tickets actually get through, that actually alerts like the administrator of the ticketing system, and they go in and change the rules to make sure that that stops. It is a game you cannot win. So we're seeing this shift now towards site reliability engineering, and a lot of what that boils down to is this sort of traditional sysadmin approach doesn't give us reliable services because we have this inherent tension. We have conflicting incentives. As a developer, as an architect, I want to release early, I want to release often, I want to always be changing. And that goes smack into the face of, whoa, I want stability. Because traditionally our prod ops, sysadmin type people, they have been incented upon availability, uptime. And so their attitude has been pour concrete over the whole thing. It works, don't breathe on it, don't touch it. I didn't fully appreciate this until, this is probably 4 or 5 years ago, I was having a conversation with the woman that ran our DevOps group, and she was explaining to me how difficult it was for her to move from 4 releases to 5. And she was saying that the lesson that she had learned from this one project that would constantly yell and scream at her group for not being able to provide infrastructure was, okay, I don't want to get chewed on every Monday morning anymore, so I'm just going to pour concrete all over the infrastructure so you can't claim the infrastructure is the reason why that you're missing all your dates. This is fundamentally why we've had trench warfare in these environments. Turns out we can all get along. We just have to take a different approach. SRE in a nutshell is, hey, what if we ask software engineers to design operations? It's kind of interesting how we do this. We've sort of had this attitude. We started doing it with testing. We said, well, the problem with testing is it's not enough like software engineering. And so we sort of threw a whole bunch of software engineering stuff at it. And we're doing the same thing now to operations and how that all works. The end of the day, I would argue it's just software engineering concepts, discipline, whatever you want to call it, applied to operations. And a lot of what that boils down to is get rid of manual tasks. Automation is your friend. You need SRE people to focus on engineering. In fact, the vast majority of people that get into this space are, in fact, software engineers. It is useful to understand some Unix, some networking, et cetera, but software engineering is really kind of the key skill set here. The operational needs today are different than they were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. Oh man, I remember how many processes they've had to work through that had a review board in it somewhere. And they had different names that went in front of it. Sometimes it was the ARB, sometimes there was the Change Advisory Board, whatever. It was all the same thing. The problem here is I need to move fast, and that doesn't let me do that. Of course, the counter here is I need to move fast but do so safely, and I need environments that can support this dynamic, constantly changing set of services. That's really what we're driving at here with site reliability engineering. How do we create these reliable services? We need these environments that can support it. This does not happen in spare cycles. So our SREs need to have time to do engineering work. They cannot be on call doing manual tasks constantly. They need to automate away the toil, the manual labor. They need to help us contain the technical sprawl. That's one of the things that happens in these microservice architectures. All of a sudden, you don't just have 1 or 2 or 3 stacks. Everybody has decided to bring everything into the house because developer autonomy. And I understand how much fun that is. We've all wanted that excuse to use insert new language here. But what you end up having very quickly is everybody has their own favorites. Everybody has their own pipeline, their own metrics. And now you don't have 1 or 2 ways of doing something. You've got almost infinity ways of doing something. You have the joy of, how do I staff up for this? How do I find a developer that knows all these languages? Hint, they don't exist. And that's before we even get into all the third-party libraries we need to support all of that. Every one of you has had this experience where somebody comes in and convinces management, let me write this in this esoteric language, and then they leave. And then you've got to play like rock, paper, scissors to see who gets to support the Galapagos Island project. We need to think about currency. These hacks are getting bigger and bigger. They're affecting larger and larger companies. They're having a huge impact on not just a few people, but millions and millions of people. The size of these hacks gets larger every time I turn around. So no, it can't be a free-for-all. There's going to have to be some guardrails, some guideposts. Some companies will say you can use anything you want as long as it's on the JVM. My last organization, part of our job as architects was to say, here are your 3 choices. If this won't work for you, you're wrong. I mean, if people really had a good reason, we'd certainly have that conversation, but a good enough reason isn't, but I just want to play with Kotlin. Great. That's not what we're here to support. We need to focus on paved roads. That's fundamentally what's happening, even at the organizations with the most ingrained developer autonomy. This is a well-worn path. We know how it works. We know how to support it. If you go off on that esoteric thing, you're on your own. What a lot of people fail to understand is there's a flip side to the coin. Developer autonomy also includes developer accountability. You are going to run it. You are going to own it. If it turns out you made a bad decision, we're going to have an uncomfortable conversation in a few months. We need to understand that if we keep adding languages, databases, technologies, eventually our level of technical debt goes through the roof. And so we need to remember Uncle Ben's wise words, with great power comes great responsibility. So sure, you want to use that sort of esoteric thing, you're on your own. You run it. Now, a lot of people would say, hey, SRE sounds a lot like DevOps. I can make an argument that it's sort of the next natural extension of that concept, or an implementation detail of DevOps. But the moral of the story is we need to think differently about how we create these environments for these services to run in. Now, one of the things that we can do to help our teams is establish principles. Because the thing you learn very quickly is you can't be everywhere at all times. You can't be involved in every single decision. I need to empower teams to make good decisions when the proverbial adult isn't in the room. We need distributed decision making. So the best thing we can do is establish principles or guardrails or guideposts or North Stars. You want to create an environment within which your projects can thrive. But that, of course, leads us to this million-dollar question. How do I know if you guys are actually doing what I want you to do? Well, that's where fitness functions come from. Every one of you is familiar with the second law of thermodynamics. I refer to this as the teenager's bedroom problem. My son is almost a teenager. And earlier this year, I was either putting something in his room or taking something out of his room, and I had a pretty hard time finding the floor. And so I looked at my wife and I said, hey, we should probably ask the kid to clean up his room. And she just looked at me and said, what hill do you want to die on today? Which is her way of saying, I do not want to die on that hill, let it go. The moral of the story is the universe wants to be disordered. So as much as I wish my son's room was more organized, I also realize he is just accepting the rule of the universe. And of course, software is not immune from that. Every one of you has started on a new greenfield project and said, this time we're going to do it right. And 3 months later, you're like, oh no. So as architects, as senior designers, senior technologists, we go through all this effort to come up with a good architecture, and we don't think a lot about how to maintain it, which is really kind of unfortunate because I can't be involved in every decision. I can't be involved in every refactoring, every new thing that gets added. So how do I make sure people are making good decisions knowing that I cannot predict the future? Well, there is one caveat. We know things are going to change. And this is where we get into this sort of interesting rub of, but architecture is supposed to be the decisions that are hard to change or the decisions we wish we'd gotten right. Well, but I know things are going to change, so isn't this sort of against Agile? And I've run into a lot of people who say, oh, we don't have architects, we're Agile. To which I always laugh and say, well, guess what? You have people making architectural decisions. It doesn't matter what their title is. For your sake, I hope they're making good ones. You'll know in a year or two. This is where we end up having 4 different UI frameworks baked into our application. Oops. So what do we do about that? Well, maybe we should change our assumptions. Maybe we should listen to Martin. He's a pretty smart guy. Build for what's in front of you. Choose technologies that can evolve and evolve one use case at a time. What if we designed architectures expecting things to change? That's why you're hearing all this sort of chatter about evolutionary architectures. Evolutionary architectures support guided incremental change across multiple dimensions. Now, in fairness, some are more evolvable than others. Every one of you has been on a project whose call tree looked something like this. They're called Death Star architectures for a reason. So maybe we deploy components, but we use feature toggles to make sure people can't get at some of that stuff quite yet. So we can now change incrementally when people are ready. We can actually do hypothesis-driven development. Imagine that. How do we know if the architecture is still doing what we need it to do? How do we know if we haven't violated some important construct? That's where fitness functions comes into the game. This comes right out of evolutionary computing. Is this mutation a success? Are we closer to or further from our goal? And for architecture, that's all about protecting the ilities, balancing those trade-offs. We want to capture and preserve those key architectural decisions. We need to identify them first. You can call them service level indicators if you want. Now the challenge here is we sort of fall into that trap of, oh, I can measure this, ergo it must be useful. Don't let the ability to measure dictate too much. Just because it can be measured doesn't mean it matters. Does anyone want to debate the usefulness of lines of code? Once you have metrics, you can start to set some goals. You can call these service level objectives, if you will. SLO is not the same thing as an SLA. The A means agreement. We have an agreement in place. Understand that that's a little different than an SLO. Now I can create fitness functions. This is essentially a test that I run to validate that my architecture still does what I think it does. How close did this design decision get us to our objectives? Now, ideally, these are all automated, but you know what? Some of these are probably still going to have to be manual. So we might decide that performance is really important, so we want all of our services to respond within an average of 100 milliseconds. We might want to keep our code maintainable, so we say we want cyclomatic complexity to be a small single-digit number. You probably don't want any cyclic dependencies. You might care about directionality of imports because you've got someone who keeps violating that. So we all understand conceptually that perfectly fine for persistence and web to include util, but if somebody goes the other direction, that's a problem. What do we do when I can't control every one of my consumers? How do I make sure that my services are still meeting their needs? Well, consumer-driven contracts to the rescue. Got all sorts of powerful tools here. There are actually unit testing tools for your application now. That's fascinating to me. I think that's awesome. There's a .NET variant as well, by the way. There's all sorts of new tools that are cropping up in this space. You might look at average response time, maximum response time. You might look at your average response time across a different user load, different numbers of requests. You might look at the number of timeouts, the number of application failures. I teach a graduate class at the University of Minnesota, and so I run them through cloud stuff, imagine that. And so one of the fitness functions that some of my students came up with is I want to know when I kick over to the next pricing tier with my cloud provider. A lot of us probably care about, hey, if there's a hard failure of an application, a new instance should spin up. Now this implies alerts when things go out of band. It also implies that there's going to be a certain amount of chaos engineering. We won't think of everything. Fitness functions are great. They remind us about what's important. They help us understand the trade-offs. That's an important part of this whole equation. I'm a big fan of fitness functions. I wish I had known about them earlier. I wish someone had created them earlier. Darn you, Neal. All right, so how do we move forward in these environments? I know this can seem a bit overwhelming, and one of the things you have to understand as soon as you bring any kind of change into an organization is you have activated people's lizard brain. Almost all of us, when there is change, the immediate reaction is change bad. Stop change. We have to approach this with empathy, with compassion. And we have to think about how do we approach someone with these ideas. This first, I guess, sort of dawned on me several years ago as I was at sort of a corporate picnic, and I was talking to a friend of mine, and I said, hey, Al, how's it going? And she's like, oh, I don't know, I'm on one of those agile projects. And my first reaction was to basically sort of roll my eyes and be like, okay, waterfaller. But then I took a step back, and I realized, hang on a sec here. Al's been doing this a long time. She's been successfully delivering code to production for decades. She's good at this. And I come along, or someone like me comes along, an agilista, and says, the way you've been doing it your entire career is wrong. You need to do it the new way. Why? You're saying that 20, 30 years of her career, she was a bad developer? Would any of you react kindly to that? And I always like to remind people that are particularly dogmatic about these things, you do realize that at some point someone's going to come along and pat you on the head and say, okay, agilista. It's going to happen. And so what we have to understand is technology adoption is a journey. Think about any technology that you love, that you use all the time. You didn't always love it. It wasn't always the most important thing in your world. The best way I can describe this to you is to tell you my journey through Git. When Git first came out, a buddy of mine got really excited about it. He's like, oh, you've got to watch this tech talk. Git's amazing. And I watched this tech talk, and I basically came away from it as, oh, if I'm not using these random shell scripts, I'm an idiot, and only morons use Subversion. I'm like, well, I like Subversion. I'm good at Subversion. Your tool sucks. And so I kind of ignored it for a while, and then a couple of friends of mine started playing with it, and they showed me some really cool stuff, and I kind of started playing with it, and eventually I'm like, hey, I really like Git. And now I'm at a point where I'm like, Git is awesome. So if I encounter someone who has never used Git before, I have to remember they are where I used to be. And so I can help them on that journey. I can maybe accelerate their journey because I know where the potholes are. The other part of this that we have to understand is people need to hear they need to have their feelings validated, I guess is the one way to think about it. When we were doing a lot of cloud stuff at my previous company, one of the things that was very successful for us was sitting down with people and talking about a day in their life. And so a lot of operations folks were very against the cloud stuff. And so I talked to them like, well, tell me what a day is like now. And then I would map that to what their day was going to look like in the future. So I'm like, yep, you're absolutely right. Your tools are going to change. You know that thing you hate to do, that goes away. You know that thing you always have to do by hand, that goes away. You do it now, it's all automated. And almost without exception, simply by having that conversation with people, by listening to them, by validating that they have emotions about this, they went from being our biggest opponents to our biggest advocates. So yeah, culture is going to change. It's just going to take time. You need to do positive reinforcement. You might need to have some guardrails in place. Again, you might need to say, hey, you can do anything as long as it's on this platform. You can pick from these flavors. Again, we need to focus on paved roads. That's what's fundamentally happening here. Here's a well-worn path. We know it works. We know how to support it. If you go off of that, you're on your own. We have to instill that in people. Again, we need to remember that this extra technology that we're bringing in can potentially exacerbate our technical debt, so we have to be vigilant about paying that down over time. We have to understand that there's going to be multiple failure modes in these environments, failure modes we haven't run into before. These are much more complex environments. It's difficult to reason about these systems. You got a bunch of small things changing all the time. How do you know what's going on? Who could have possibly predicted this? So yeah, you're going to get some new interesting failure cases. Again, chaos engineering is your friend. Don't be afraid to unleash a little bit of chaos on your systems. Accept the fact that your systems are going to fail. You cannot prevent all failures. Almost every software development lifecycle I've ever been a part of, the whole goal was prevent bad things from happening. I've never once seen an SDLC that actually audited itself to say, did we actually prevent the bad thing from happening? And worse, they never had a plan in place for when the bad thing happened, because bad things happen. So you can't predict, you can't prevent, but you can prepare. Your resources do not, in fact, scale to infinity. There will be competition for headcount. There will be competition for staff. There will be competition for prioritization. Do not underestimate the battle for headcount in an organization. I have never once seen a manager or a VP say, yeah, actually, my team's way too big. Give me less headcount. I've never seen a VP say, you know what, my portfolio is not, in fact, the most important portfolio in the entire company. You can go ahead and slash 10% off my budget. It'll be just fine. Who could have predicted that? Moral of the story, gang, if we're going to bring in a technology change, we have to be prepared for the cultural shift that's a part of it. We have to think about that. We have to remember that when I introduce change, people are going to initially sort of push back on that. We have to react with empathy and compassion. I wish you luck. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy lunch.